he didn't support democracy. It was more that than anything to do with religious reasons. But if you say he was killed for religion reasons, this brings up a dichotomy, because Plato believed in capital punishment for atheists.
Yes.
So, in other words, Plato is thinking, all right, if we're killing Socrates for religious reasons, then it's quite legal.
He's going to give you 5 years in the can first.
Well, yeah, that's the second
I don't remember the details, but it's pretty horrific.
Yeah.
I agree that Socrates was not convicted for religious reasons, but the charges were religious charges. It was a charge of impiety generically, and the three components of it was corrupting the young, not believing in the gods of the city, and substituting new divinities. And the claim was that the corruption consisted in teaching these new divinities. That was all trumped up, and I believe that it was a kind of camouflage for a politically motivated prosecution that couldn't say outright what the real reasons were. Yes?
I think we can add to that being a fascist by nature, they didn't have the name, but being a fascist by nature was certainly a popular thing in those days.
Yeah,
Plato was far more
some of his
fascist
students
than anyone
became
else.
worse than fascists. They became real horrible murderers.
Well, Critias was the prime example, and it was he and Alcibiades in particular who betrayed Athens during the war, went over to the Spartan side, also was involved in profaning the mysteries in 415, and Critias, the leader of the more bloodthirsty faction of the 30, whose conduct, I think, both of whom were associates of Socrates, and their conduct, I think, was behind the prosecution of Socrates, who was blamed, rightly or wrongly is another question, for having, being responsible for the way they thought and therefore the way they acted.
So corruptors of the youth actually was a fair charge then?
I don't, we actually have the text of the indictment, and it says that, and I don't know what the legal regime was in specific terms. I doubt there was a statute that said, "Thou shalt not corrupt the youth." I think it was a pretty rough and ready legal system. Anybody could bring a charge against anybody. There was no public prosecutor. It was all by jury. We had a jury of 501. We had 1 day for the trial. Prosecution spoke first. Defense spoke next. Limited by the clock. Jurors had their tokens. They put them in the guilty box or the innocent box. They counted it up, and the majority decided. And if you didn't get at least 20% of the votes for on the side of the prosecution, you would have to pay a fine. So that was a way of discouraging frivolous prosecutions. And there was not a lot of fine legal argument. Basically, each juror would make up their own mind without a judge to summarize the law for them as to whether they thought this defendant was guilty of the charge that the prosecution had brought. So I very much doubt that there was, I'm certain in my bones, although I haven't actually looked at the legal system of ancient Athens, that there was no statute that said, "Thou shalt not corrupt the youth." Yes?
Actually, hang on. Since this is kind of dragging out, we're just going to go till around age 40 or so, and then, so keep your comments till the end, and then we'll take your questions and answers.
Okay, you want me to kind
So
of...
just kind of keep going rather
All
than
right.
getting distracted. We'll go on for like
Okay,
another
so why don't I just hit the highlights, and I got 15 minutes to kind of wrap up what I'm going to say. I'm going to jump then over the two quotations from Aristotle. We'll ignore him. I come then to a guy named Euhemerus, who is from the 3rd century BCE, that is the 200s. who was not a philosopher, but who was a kind of deconstructor of myths, of mythology. So this falls into the category of explanations of belief in the gods. And his explanation is that those who so far excelled the rest in strength and intelligence invented for themselves a kind of superhuman and divine authority, and in consequence were accounted by the population as gods. So somebody who fancied himself, usually was a him, as a really great individual, claimed to be a god and claimed this authority for himself and got people to believe it. And this was how Euhemerus would explain different gods. And there is, in fact, a way of explaining myths according to this principle called Euhemerist explanation, which supposes that the god is really a human being from some time ago, who claimed a kind of divine authority for himself, or was thought by people to be divine, and so got elevated to divine status. And one writer in whom you find this sort of explanation of stories about the gods quite frequently is the poet Robert Graves, who has a 2-volume work called The Greek Myths. And if you read that, you'll see him often explaining these stories in terms of some real, actual human being who is transformed into a god. Now, this quotation doesn't say this is how all the beliefs in the gods got going, so it's compatible with believing that there really are gods, but insofar as some of the gods, at least, are really human beings who gave themselves a divine authority, they obviously, on Euhemerus' explanation, are not really gods. Epicurus, who's in the next 2 quotations, and Lucretius, his follower, were atomists like Democritus, and they had the view that any concept that we have is actually a generalization from what we have previously perceived, a kind of general image. Like the concept of a tree would be put together from previously seen trees that we've stored in our memory, and we put these different memories together, and that generalized image is our concept of a tree. So the explanation of the concept of a god would have to be that we actually had perceived gods. How else could we get a concept of the god? And Epicurus supposed that we perceive them in our dreams, that we wouldn't be aware of these gods in our waking life for the reasons that I mentioned before, but when we dream of these powerful beings, large beings, whatever, those are gods, and we've got a concept of the gods that is a kind of generalized image from these previous experiences. And furthermore, he thought that our concepts were actually veridical. So this kind of concretization that you talk about of concepts was part of Epicurus' idea, and that the words, the general words that we used, were kind of labels for these concepts, and that whatever the word meant, there was really something corresponding to it. And how could you tell what the word meant? It was the first thing that came into your mind when you heard the word. And what's the first thing that comes into your mind when you hear the word God, theos in Greek? Well, according to Epicurus, it was the idea